Thanks so much for coming to Alumni Weekend, and welcome to our Uncommon Core session, featuring Tom Heberlein and Micere Keels. Really excited to have them both here today. My name's Sophia Gross. I'm AV class of 2015, very proud alum. I was an Odyssey Scholar here at UChicago. For those of you who don't know, it's UChicago's comprehensive model for dismantling obstacles to education and careers for talented, hardworking students with financial need. For me, I absolutely would not be where I am today without, one, attending the University of Chicago, and then additionally getting all the resources, both in terms of my academic career, but also my professional career. I focused on international relations and modern Middle Eastern history. Now I work in tech. Nonetheless, really my passion for knowledge and nonstop desire to learn was fostered here, and I would have ended up in a very different place had it not been for the Odyssey Scholarship. If you'd like to learn more about it and give to this amazing program, you can find more information at odyssey.uchicago.edu. Gotta do that plug. Today we're going to hear from two scholars who will present on topics with direct relevance to the Odyssey program and access to education. Our first presenter is Professor Tom Heberlein, who arrived at the University of Chicago in 1963. I think I saw he's celebrating his 50th reunion. Yes? Yeah? Awesome. As part of the class of 1967. He was recruited from Portage, Wisconsin by what was called the Small School Talent Search Program. He graduated with an AB in sociology, inspired by Professors Gilbert White and Fred Strodbeck. Tom went on to get an MA and PhD at the University of Wisconsin, where he specialized in the new field of environmental sociology. After a year as an assistant professor at the University of Colorado, he returned to Madison for the rest of his career at what is now the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology. In 2004, he moved to Sweden, where he began teaching at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. Today, he divides his time between Madison and Stockholm, both great places, where he is working on a memoir, Falling in Love with Sweden, one mistake at a time. Around a campfire in the Serengeti during an alumni trip, UC professor of African history Ralph Austin encouraged Tom to go back and learn more about this little-known small school talent search program. Austin had been on campus in the late 1960s as the definition of diversity was being debated. Tom's report was published in the University of Chicago magazine in February. This is still a work in progress with many more stories yet to be told, and he hopes to learn more from you in the audience today. Our second presenter, Micere Keels, is Associate Professor in Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. Her research focuses on understanding how socio-demographic characteristics, including race, ethnicity, and poverty in particular, structure the supports and challenges that children and youth experience. Over the past decade and a half, her work has examined several issues regarding educational inequality. Regarding this topic of this convening, she is drawing from her research that is a tracking sample of 500 Black and Latino freshmen across their first 4 years of college. This project is examining the unfolding early adult trajectory of students who are above average in their college preparedness, which allows her to focus on barriers to success among a group that possesses the academic and motivational prerequisites for post-secondary success. At the end of both presentations, we're going to open it up to Q&A, and we ask that you hold on to your questions until the very end. Please join me in welcoming them. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's an incredible honor to give my first and last lecture at the University of Chicago. Amid so many old friends and new friends who I've made in the last 2 years, making phone calls, asking you folks to say, remember what your high school counselor said to you 55 years ago. So thank you all for coming today. My research on this has really already been published, and you have the off-prints from the alumni magazine. And so I'm going to do something other than give you a sociologist 50 slides in 10 minutes on what I found. I want to start out with this first slide, which is something very new and something many of us in this room should be very proud of. This is a small school talent search alumni badge, first recognition of this program at any time. If you were a GRITS kid, Grassroots Talent Search, you should be wearing one of these too, because these were basically the same program, just used with 2 different names, and GRITS was spelled 2 different ways. There are many unknowns about this program, and because I am still struggling to learn much of its dimensions, like I don't know when it ended. I'm hopeful that some of you in this room will have that knowledge. And so we're passing around a sign-up sheet, a contact sheet. If I've not been bugging you with emails or telephone calls and you want to contribute in some way to this, please put your name and email address and on the list, and put whether you think you were a member of the SSTS or the GRITS. Also, those of you who were not members, it turns out you played a very key role, and that is just emerging. And so if you knew one of us, helped one of us, got in a fight with one of us, promoted one of us, saved one of us, and can tell me about that, please put your names on here and a little note in the remarks that, you know, Heberlein never would have graduated if it wasn't for the help I gave him on a paper. And I would like that very much. We're planning tomorrow morning a 10 o'clock meeting at the Quadrangle Club in the lounge of all of us, I would call the SSTS 11 from the class of 1967, and anyone else who wants to join us to talk more about this in a less public space and decide where we might go from there. So what I'm going to do in this talk is really, as I said, give an author talk rather than a scientist talk. I'll give you a little background on how the project started, talk about 3 surprises, talk about how this, what we have found, I think, speaks to the current situation in the academy. And because this is the University of Chicago, I have to give you a little puzzle and a little project to work on to chat with each other about. And so you've already heard that this project began in darkest Africa. It's fun that Chicago projects have this international flavor. Ralph was leading this tour. You know, you get these things from the Alumni Association, and Betty and I decided to go on one, and I mentioned about the small school talent search to Ralph, Ralph Austin, who's a professor in African history, and he actually knew something about the program because in the 1970s, the University of Chicago started to realize that maybe minorities are more than just white guys from, and gals from Montana, and maybe it's got something to do with people of color. And African studies got brought into that, and Ralph knew something about it, but he didn't know very much. So he encouraged me to go to the Regenstein Library, and I was thrilled for the opportunity to do that because the Reg wasn't here when we were here. And I've been reading about this place for like 40 years, and I really wanted to go there. And I've been bragging about it since it was built, that my alma mater tore down the football stadium and built a library. Now you have to realize I live exactly across the street from Camp Randall Stadium at Madison. You can hit it with a stone from my front yard. Could you imagine tearing down that and building a library? Well, you can imagine it, but probably shouldn't. So I went to the Reg, got my library card. I was all ready to go and find dissertations and books and boxes of letters about the program and an analysis of how democracy was changed by bringing in rural kids, and they'd go back out to Montana and change the world. And I found actually one news article in a magazine called Grits, a very important list of all of the people in my class, the class of 67, 45 or 46 of us who got the, who were listed as a member of the small school talent search program. There were articles also by Muriel Beadle. Muriel has written about some of this in her memoir, and I strongly recommend those of you who were here in the 60s to read her memoir. It's great fun. and she spends a couple of pages on the small school talent search. When I first went to the library, Dean Boyer's wonderful book had not yet been published. So it was a year later that came out, and I said, oh, now I'm going to learn about the small school talent search. And every sit-in and every riot and every war protest was carefully documented. But this thing that got us from rural communities out to the world got not one word. Now, the good news about this book is he described the situation at the University of Chicago in the 1950s. And in the 1950s, things were tough around here. Enrollments were declining. Traditional feeder schools that had been sending students to Chicago weren't sending them anymore. The attrition rate of the class of 1960, only 50% graduated. This was not a place that looked like a good place to invest your students. And the president called for finding new markets. And they went out and found one new market, which were these rural schools. So this was basically a marketing program, as I described in the article itself. So given that there was nothing in the library, I did what any sociologist does, goes out and tries to collect the data. So basically I interviewed 18 of the 46 in the small school talent search. 6 are deceased, it looks like, so there are only 40 of us left. I interviewed 5 who were not in the program, and it turns out they were particularly interesting. These are people who called me or sent me emails and said, you know, I'm from Milwaukee, Oregon, and I must have been in the program. So these interviews surprisingly gave me a lot of perspective that I wouldn't have gotten just from interviewing those in the small school talent search. I spent an hour with Dean Boyer, who again told me he didn't know much about the program, but was able to help me understand the context, particularly with his stories about Charles O'Connell, and the pieces really started to fit together. Had the chance to contact James Weiss, who's here today. Jim is known to a lot of the people in our class, and he was very helpful and even provided some data. I then tracked down my college roommates, who I hadn't seen in years and who were not in the small school talent search program, and I learned from them. So that's the data. Basically, in this process, there were a lot of surprises, but 3 I want to mention. One was that the program boundaries were incredibly fuzzy. And so I've just had a guy come up today from a farm in Illinois and said, well, I was in the GRITS program, and you know, these boundaries are fuzzy. And I had a chance to interview Sandra Kelly. Some of you may know Sandra. She's in our class. She came from Barton, Vermont, with a population of 3,000. It's up in the Northeast Kingdom. She had a graduating class of 27 students. She was not in the program because small schools were only those in the marketing watershed of the Midwest and, interestingly enough, Montana. Sandy applied to both Chicago and Stanford and got into both of them without the benefit of the small school talent search program. I met by telephone Rob LaRock, came from a very small town in Montana, went to one-room schools. His parents were enrolled in the Fort Peck, Assiniboine, and Sioux tribes. He was not part of the program because he graduated from Flathead County, Montana High School, and there were 300 in his graduating class. And the reason there were 300 is this high school draws kids from little towns all over western Montana. So he was very rural, a minority group member of an American Indian, but he wasn't part of the small school talent search program. I got to meet Sherry Register. Sherry has written a wonderful memoir on growing up in Albert Lea, Minnesota. It's called Packing House Daughter. She jokes that that's her PhD was being a packing house daughter. There's a great story in there about wanting to get a uniform blue shirt so she could fit in at the University of Chicago with her classmates, and her dad threw a blood-stained, bloody shirt across the dining room table at her, asked her to take the real thing to the University of Chicago. Sherry was not part of the program, even though she came from a small town, and she came here on a relatively prestigious humanities scholarships. So the official count is about 8% of the entering class of 1967 were rural kids, but the fact is, I think it was much higher than that. I think we're probably talking 12 or 13%. The other thing I discovered was how poor we were and how poor other students. We weren't the only ones who were poor. Mary Ellen Kipley, who lived in the village of Lodi with me for about 30 years, she pointed out that their family with 9 children and 2 adults, 11 in the family, had no running water. Well, she said, we had running water, you had to run out to the pump and get it. And on cold Minnesota days and nights, they had only an outhouse while she was growing up. Fred Manasseh, from way up north, just a couple miles south of the Canadian border, he pointed out that they didn't have they did not have running water either, and their outhouse was even colder than the one down in Worthington, Minnesota. Fred also had no electricity. He lived 20 miles from International Falls, and the International Falls Library sent out a box of books every week that he read by kerosene or gasoline lanterns. But then I discovered through these other interviews that we weren't the only ones who grew up without plumbing. One of my classmates from Chicago, 18 miles from the University of Chicago, also did not have plumbing until he was 11 years old. Another classmate lived with a single parent with her sister in a house trailer in a trailer park outside of Springfield, Massachusetts. So Chicago, somehow in its need to find any students at all, attracted a more diverse kind of student body than I had guessed. We Grits kids were not alone. Looking at the dropout rates, discovered that 4 out of 10 of us Grits kids did not graduate from the University of Chicago, which is, of course, a lot better than the class of 1960, but it is still 4 out of 10 that didn't make it. 38% attrition rate. For the class as a whole, we lost 26% of the students. So attrition rates were much higher then than they are now. And I worried about this even when I was an undergraduate, when Laurie Salee didn't come back anymore. Laurie was one of the nicest guys I'd ever met from Iowa, and he was not there the second year. But off and on for the next 50 years, I just wondered what happened to these people, and now I had an excuse to find out. So I interviewed 5 who did not complete at the University of Chicago. 2 had graduated from other institutions in 1967, the same time they would have graduated with our class. 1 graduated later and got a master's degree in library science and actually wrote an article about the small school talent search program that she published in 1967. The 2 that did not graduate, 1 retired with the job title of research scientist from a major corporation, and the last one was headed for Botswana the day after I interviewed her. This doesn't sound like failure to me. Now, I don't think that stands for everybody, but our dropouts did not all crash and burn. Moreover, what surprised me most in these 5 interviews was that they had incredibly positive feelings about the university and their experience. They did not blame the university for recruiting them or letting them down somehow, but they cherished and celebrated their time on campus. Quote, "Those 4 quarters changed my whole life." Quote, "It was like going to the Grand Canyon. You can read about it and see pictures, but you have to be there to understand." I did find a number of my friends who were not in the Small School Talent Search program and who did graduate who absolutely hated their experience at the University of Chicago. They did not like the teaching or the environment. They got little out of it but agony out of the experience, and they left with low self-esteem that took them years to recover from. And as you can imagine, they do not show up at reunions or send money. So perhaps we small school talent search kids were grittier than I thought. So there are lessons from today. This is not 50-year-old data. This speaks to stuff that you're seeing in the newspapers right now. Here's a couple of stories that were in the New York Times in January. Colleges discovered the rural students. The way that the small school talent search worked to recruit people in the 1960s was to pick schools at random, small schools, send them a very nice letter, and I'd love to get a copy of this letter, a letter to the guidance counselor saying, "We've picked your school, send us the best student you've got, and if they are needy, we'll provide funding." Well, you can see how needy that we were. We were all quite needy. This personalized letter went to the guidance counselor. Those of us in the program, those of us in rural communities had been spotted. Mary Ellen was a National Merit Scholar. Fred was a National Merit Scholar. I went to Boys Nation. We were noticed and supported in the communities, and the guidance counselor said, "You." And he said, "Well, me what?" "You go to the University of Chicago." And many of us said, "Where is the University of Chicago?" But we trusted our guidance counselors, and we went. Now, this article came out in May 21st, 1917, bringing the dream of an elite college to rural students, and somebody has caught on to what we discovered 50 years ago. They've invented something called the College Advising Corps. It's a nonprofit, and it sends free guidance counselors, extra guidance counselors, to rural schools. They've got 182 of these students who have graduated often from elite colleges go and work in these schools and help the students understand there are other places to go than Mankato State or the local community college. They have a budget of $34 million, and as I said, there are 182 of them now. So they've learned we got to work through the guidance counselors, but you can't work through just the guidance counselors that are already there. A lesson from the small school talent search. One of the things I've been doing on this project is trying to find some experts in the sociology and economics of education who would take on this project and sort of see it as something worth studying. This is a tremendous resource, but all I've done is done some boring pit holes and discovered there's ore or gold down there. So one of the people who was recommended to me was Michael Mcpherson, who's the former president of the Spencer Foundation, which is a major funder of educational research. He's just retired, and when I looked him up, I discovered, goodness gracious, he was a classmate in the class of 1967 and got 3 degrees from the University of Chicago. And he points out what the issue is. Thanks me for the article, but he says it's all too common for universities and colleges to bring students whose backgrounds are different from the prevailing ones, and then assume the students will figure it out. Today, those students, etc., may be more likely to be black or brown. And that is the issue. And that's what I suddenly realized. The reason so many of us were successful is we got the help from you, our classmates, who brought us into your world and didn't shut us out and helped us when we needed it. So your exercise to discuss over cocktails and at dinner is this. This comes from the Princeton Alumni Magazine. It's my daughter-in-law who sends me all this stuff from Princeton. Here's a conversation between a low-income first gen. They call them flies. I think Odyssey student is much better. It's a better name to be on an Odyssey than to be out there with somebody calling you low income right in the title. But here's a little discussion, right? Now I want you to think about how it is that we could have that discussion in a way that benefited both of the people in that group. What is it that we need to do with the students who are not from the small towns to help the two reach out and get together? So with that, I'm going to end. I want to congratulate all of the people from the small towns who were successful and are here today, and I'd like to congratulate all of you here who helped us get where we are. Give yourselves a hand. Even if you're from Milwaukee, Oregon. All right.
So I'm going to, there we go, I assume that's on. So my name is Micere Keels. I said I'm an associate professor here, and I do work on issues of educational inequality. I focus more on racial and ethnic as well as income inequality in terms of students' K-12 experiences, and more recently through this project that I'll speak a little bit about, transition to college and into and through college. And so what I've done today is highlight some of the lessons learned from the article that Tom did and connect that to some of the things that I've learned in the work following Black and Latinx students transitioning into college. So we're going to start with this No Small Talent article. And essentially what I'm going to do is pick out some of the quotes from that article and then show the general theme and issue behind that quote that relates to this transition into college process and success in college process. And I'm talking about identity-conscious supports, and we'll talk a little bit about that, about what that is. But more, the goal for this talk is just to connect what most people think about when you say identity-conscious supports. They think of racial and ethnic identity, and that is one identity of the students that I look at. But I'm going to here in this talk connect it to the issue of just being a historically underrepresented student at an institution and how the same concept works across all historically underrepresented groups. So one of those big things is going beyond surface characteristics in terms of understanding what difference means. And in the article, the difference surface characteristic is that it's speaking about students that came from small rural communities. And students from small rural communities, as you concluded at the end, were brought to the university and then told to join the pack, join the fold, and work your way through. But that did not recognize many of the other ways in which those students were different from the demographically normative and culturally normative aspect of the University of Chicago's population of students, the faculty, and all of those things. So one of the quotes taken from the article is my entire knowledge of chem was covered in the first 3 minutes of the first chemistry lecture, while kids from the Bronx High School of Science were looking bored. And that's the aspect of differential academic preparation in K-12 schooling. So you came from rural communities, but it also meant that you attended very different schools in terms of resources, in terms of the extent to which AP courses were offered, in terms of the qualifications of the teachers that you had, and all of those things. So because of how educational resources are differentially distributed in this country, and they're differentially distributed geographically, both across states, across rural and urban communities, and also within an urban community, differentially distributed across higher and low income neighborhoods in a given city, if you want to take Chicago as one of them. And that means that when everybody comes to a particular institution freshman year, you don't all have the same levels of preparation. You have the same levels of talent, but you have received different preparation, but there is no adjustment or even often recognition of that. Everybody is simply thrown into the same classes and expected to figure it out. And generally, what's going to happen in terms of the faculty is that we're teaching from the assumption that everyone that's in this class today is like the traditional cohort of students that came however many generations ago, and not really understanding how things have changed. So another aspect is this one. And so since she was a high school sophomore and got exactly, she dreamed of coming to Chicago since she was a high school sophomore and got exactly the roommate she wanted, a sophisticated girl from New York City. But the cultural gap turned out to be larger than Kant anticipated. And after 6 weeks, she switched, getting a roommate whose background was more similar to her own. So the issue of, there are also cultural differences. Culture is a nebulous word, has many different meanings. But one way of thinking of it is habits and ways of doing things, preferences, the way one spends leisure time, the way you dress, and all of those things that make up differences in culture that, again, when you show up freshman year, everyone's thrown in together. And oftentimes, because these things, again, aren't named and aren't discussed, there is no support that students are giving to figure out, well, how do we recognize and navigate and talk about some of our cultural differences? The other one, in many cases, it wasn't that we didn't work hard, it was that we didn't work very smart. So that's the issue of having instrumental knowledge on how to do college. So again, everybody may show up with same levels of underlying academic talent, academic abilities, but what's different is the extent to which you know, okay, based on how a professor gives a lecture, I know that I can focus on these things and I can ignore all of these things over here. And that's learned differently depending on the high schools that you go to. Because some students go to high schools where they really are experiencing lectures and a curricula that's much more closely aligned to how things are going to be done in college, versus others who experience one where you learn and you do everything that is in the book, you do everything that the professor says, rather than being that more savvy and skilled way of figuring out, what do I really need to know and what can I ignore? What do I really need to spend my time on, or what can I brush aside? And that matters when you get to college and so much information is thrown at you, and being able to have those navigational skills. So that's one of those differences there. These are all of the things that are below the surface, that simply knowing that simply classifying students as, rural school, small school student aren't talked about and aren't discussed, and then aren't supported in the transition process. So what's the other? The other set of issues is the aspect of thinking about the institution versus the student's needs in the act of engaging in diversifying an institution. So one, again, taken from the article, enrollment in the college in the 1950s was down by over 50%. This meant that admissions officials had to try to expand the applicant base of the college by recruiting more students from distant and unfamiliar places. So that is diversity undertaken in service of the institution's needs. They pretty much just said, welcome. We're glad you're here, and threw me in the deep, from Lauren Nelson. The program had been developed by admissions, and after we matriculated, they seemed to think their job was done. So thinking about students' needs, you're moving towards going from just access of getting them here in terms of persistence. What do we need to do as an institution to support them through the process to make sure that graduation, which should be the goal, is the goal that you keep your eye on? Except for a mimeographed list that did not give room addresses, we had no idea who else was struggling like us. So the important aspects of a critical mass and networking. Again, if you're thinking about what students need, it's the aspect of making sure that you bring enough of them that are from whatever historically marginalized group to campus, and then you make sure that they are networked with each other so that they can provide supports to each other, and also so that simply the aspect of knowing that I am not alone in this struggle when if most of your interactions are with students that have this knowledge of how to do college, and it seems like everything is just going so beautifully and so easy for that student, then you shift your perspective from, well, there's something wrong with how this institution is supporting me, to must be something wrong with me, because everybody else that I know, it's just going beautifully. It's just fine. So that means there's something wrong with me and my talents and my abilities, rather than there's something wrong with this context, which you're more likely to think about if you can see that others that came from your similar background are also struggling in similar ways. So in a way of summing all of this up, the University of Chicago's Small School Talent Search was initiated in part to meet the recruitment needs of the university, and some hoped it might change the campus culture. Predictably, the university changed us more than we changed it. Little was done to help with our deficiencies and bridge the cultural chasm between our small towns and the great urban community of scholars. So again, it's not to say that it wasn't a beneficial program, and it's not to say it's diversity that should not be undertaken by the part of the institution, but who are you centering in these acts of diversity? And shifting to one where diversity is undertaken in service of the advancement of historically marginalized students. So shifting the perspective from just meeting whatever goals the institution needs. At that moment, it may have been enrollment. In this current moment, diversity is often undertaken in terms of improving the institution's reputation with regarding being a cosmopolitan space where students are brought from many different economic backgrounds and racial and ethnic backgrounds. But again, that is a framing that is about the institution's reputation and not centering the goal of actually advancing his students from historically underrepresented groups. So if we shift towards centering diversity for the purpose of advancing historically underrepresented groups, what might that look like, and what are some of those things that we're going to think about? And that's where the issue of counter spaces comes in, and the issue of identity-conscious supports. So centering historically marginalized students. One of those things is calling a thing a thing. So being able to say that, for example, in the work that I do, race and ethnicity matters. Socioeconomic status matters. Whether you're a first-generation college student matters. Ability status matters. So all of those things where a particular group of students might be in the demographic minority, and also in particular when that characteristic is one of being in a historically marginalized demographic minority, it's important to recognize that those are individuals for whom these institutions were not built. And so the culture of these institutions are not necessarily organized in a way that supports their development. So why does this matter so much? It matters because college is costly. It is wonderful that those 5 students that you talked to who did not graduate from this institution either went on to graduate someplace else or had other wonderful careers that we would still absolutely call a success. So I am, strangely enough, even though I'm a faculty member here, I am not somebody that says everybody should go to college or your life just is not a value or a success if you don't have a college degree. I think there are a ton of things out there that people can do and be successful at that don't require a college degree, either because it's more aligned with their interests. If your dream is to become a chef, certainly not going to push that high schooler to say, but you need to go to college first, because there are many other forms of knowledge. A couple years ago, was at a kind of mentoring program for high school students in Chicago, and it was at a tech company that was doing the mentoring. Historically marginalized students, the goal of connecting them with mentors that would get them this tech experience and then promote them going into college. And there's a student at the back of the room who was really disengaged, and I talked to him. And he was like, this is not for me. I'm really not interested in this tech stuff. And so asking about, well, why are you here? He's like, well, I got to figure this out somehow. And, I've got to go to college. But just talking to him what he's interested in, he wants to go, and being in the funeral home business is what he wants to do. And so I was thinking, but yet everything and everyone is saying you have to go to college, you have to get that degree, but nobody ever asked, well, what do you actually want to do as a profession, as a career? And so that's an aspect of thinking about the fact that college is costly in that you are giving something else up in order to spend your time in college. So if we are bringing students into an institution, it is really important to think about the things that matter for their success and really push to make sure that persistence through to degree attainment happens and beyond. So the other aspect, diversity should be more than a commodity, which means, as I started saying, that diversity is often undertaken to improve an institution's reputation so that they can draw actually more majority students and higher income students because they want to go to colleges and institutions that are seen as this cosmopolitan, diverse place. But then again, when those diverse students are brought to campus, they're often not supported in some really important and key ways. And so lastly, thinking on this slide, recognizing and advancing the cultural capital the historically marginalized students bring. So oftentimes, what happens with historically marginalized students, we ended with this slide that talked about this no small talent, is that it's the students that we are trying to shift in these institutions. And so when we recognize, oh, here's a student from a different background, how do we change you so that you fit here? And often don't think about, well, what are some of the ways that maybe this institution could shift and could grow and could expand in terms of what's considered valued cultural capital that could advance our understanding. And so we get to, I'm assuming, since you are alumni of this institution, and you're here, so you pay attention to things that come out of this institution, that you have some awareness of this discussion that happened in the fall in terms of how the new cohort of students were greeted, in part saying that we don't do safe spaces here. With the idea being that if you come here, get ready for our combative intellectual environment that will challenge everything that you think, and that's just how we do it here. But that's based on the idea that historically marginalized students and underrepresented students don't benefit from being able to connect with just each other at times and having spaces where they are able and supported in separating from the dominant larger institutional culture. And that by separating and being in those safe spaces, they will actually learn from each other and be able to go back out and engage more with the majority students on campus. So it's also based on the idea that historically marginalized students, recognizing that they spend the majority of their day with majority students, with majority faculty, with majority administrators and staff. And so it might actually be very beneficial to support them in these safe spaces. We no longer, those that do work on this no longer use the word safe spaces because it has been so co-opted. And now we use the word counter spaces. So the idea being that this is that counter spaces are places where individuals of a similar social identity, it could be race or ethnicity, it could be socioeconomic status, it could be ability status, that by them gathering together in those spaces, they can develop new and radical knowledge, and knowledge that allows them to transform stereotypes of their difference. And so really framing that differently. Lastly, in efforts and engagements that you do with this institution, it's important to think about some of those priorities going forward. And this is about, this is unfortunate, as far back as the data go. So this is the University of Chicago data with regards to the % of students that receive Pell Grant. So the lowest income students at the institution. And so I'm sure you guys also know about growing endowment at this institution. But there's a decreasing decreasing fraction of the freshman student body that is of these lowest income, of this lowest income group across these years. And so the question is whether this is a diminishing priority, and how do we keep that as an important part of what happens here. I'll leave it there. And just so that, because the college has grown, that you're not assuming that it's just because there's simply the same priority but a smaller fraction of that size of the college. Just noting that in actual number, they are actually a smaller, a diminishing priority, possibly, at this institution. And lastly, because we're at the University of Chicago, and comparisons matter. Comparisons to peer institutions matter in terms of driving action. And these are the top 25 universities in the US in terms of many different rankings. But on this, they are ranked in terms of the % of undergraduates receiving Pell Grant.
Not the only measure.
Absolutely. But it's the only one where we have data. A lot of the others, they don't report the data. And I completely agree.
The university's program has been to go as far as they could to reduce Pell Grants.
When did the Odyssey Scholarship Program come in and start to impact these students?
So you can still receive the Pell Grant. It doesn't, other scholarships do not prevent you from receiving the Pell Grant at all. No, that the Pell Grant is a federal grant. It has zero connection with any institutional scholarships. So, but this is only one measure, and I will leave it in the framework in terms of how Tom did his, which is, it's a question and it's a puzzle of whether it is a diminishing priority and whether it's something that the institution needs to think more thoughtfully about. Yes?
The more money that's given for scholarships, the less people will need to get grants or Pell Grants. So as the university is giving more and more money to people from lower incomes, it would just make sense.
They would have less need for loans.
Right.
So this is a federal grant that has nothing to do with the student loans. Yes, what all of those funding, all of those scholarships done has been wonderful for removing loans as a part of students' aid packages. But it does not affect, they're still completely eligible to receive the amount of Pell Grant that they would get. It's based on family resources.
But they may not need it.
They still get it. The institutions still get it. So no institution that thinks anything about economics would get money from the government and say, no, thank you. Yeah, it's something they get by enrolling students of a particular financial level. And so let me help, I guess. I can offer a little bit of help for thinking about why this might happen. Part of it is because of the economic downturn. So that means the income cap for receiving some of these fellowships goes up as more. So at one point in time, you may give these fellowships to families that say are that have $50,000 in their household income. But you may raise that cap to giving it to families that have $60,000 or families that have $75,000. So you could raise the income cap for, say, the Odyssey scholarship, but by doing so, a smaller percent of those students that will come in are the very lowest income group, and they are in that more middle income group. But it's just a matter of thinking about the extent to which students that may be as financially disadvantaged as some of you were may now be a smaller fraction of cohorts going forward. But it's a puzzle and a question, and something to ponder, to the extent that it is an important priority to maintain. And I need to be quiet for questions.
Well, we were going to open it up for questions if everyone's ready. Thank you so much to both of our presenters. And they're both available. If you feel like you'd like to use a microphone, I'm happy to bring it to you. If not, just feel free to raise your hand and you can yell out if you want.
Well, I think I know the answer, but why were there so many Montanans?
Have you ever seen a movie, The River Runs Through It? Margaret Perry was in the English department, and the English department was pretty clubby in those days, I'm finding out. Jim Weiss is here, and he can speak to that better than I can. And Margaret went out to visit I keep saying McPhee, not McPhee, McLean, and liked Montana. And so when Jim proposed this marketing strategy for the Midwest, it had worked in Indiana, at least the pilot, he got the idea in Indiana. And she said, well, what about the Midwest, and could we have Montana too? And Jim said, sure, why not? He just didn't want it to go further east. And so Miss Perry spent some time in Montana and recruited a bunch of people from Montana, some of whom are here. Yes?
I can't speak about 1963, when she apparently only did Montana. But by 1965, she made it to Vancouver, Washington. And I don't think I'm the only person from the Washington, Oregon area that she recruited. I'm from Oregon. And two classmates of mine at Milwaukee High School that Tom has mentioned several times were recruited because there was a fellow named Bill Grady who was on the admissions committee. And he had graduated from my high school, and he was committed to recruiting several people each year to come to the University of Chicago. And my story is when I got accepted.
Can't hear you, Candy.
Oh, I'm sorry. My story is when I got accepted. Sorry.
There we go.
Here we go. All right, we'll go audio. When I got accepted to the University of Chicago and told my friends and their parents where I was going, they would say, I'm not exactly sure where Chicago is.
Right.
And I would say to them, it's just a little bit east of Idaho. And they all say, oh, I know exactly where that is. And then I came to the University of Chicago, and I said, I'm from Oregon. And my classmates would say, where exactly is Oregon? And I would say, it's just a little north of Hollywood. And they all said, oh, I know exactly where it is. So anyway, so the way that Jim Block and I and Diana Klinker got here was because of one person on the admissions committee. But we always thought we were part of the program, and we went to some of the Sherry functions with Margaret Perry and all of that. So the boundaries were very fuzzy.
Yep.
But we were a fortunate few, absolutely.
Well, that,
Jim?
that connection is, I worked full-time in the admissions office for 2 years and inherited the Pacific Northwest. So I'm the one who recruited Bill Spady, and I didn't understand what was being said about Milwaukee, Oregon. Well, that's a suburb of Portland, and I visited the school. And
It's not Shelby, Montana, I'll tell you that.
Pardon me?
It's not Shelby, Montana.
No,
It's not Munising, Michigan.
No,
I got
but
married in Milwaukee, so I have Milwaukee, Oregon. So I have some direct experience. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, I think that Margaret also treated the Pacific Northwest as her territory, as well as the small schools students, and so would probably just add people to the party.
So I get to wear one of those buttons, right?
You do. We were very unusual here, and you can count diversity in all sorts of ways, and so I'm quite willing to since nobody had a letter. I have no letters that said you have been recruited by the Small School Talent Search Program. If any of you have them in your files, please send me one. But all the letters of offer I have seen, people have had said nothing about the Small School Talent Search Program. It was only in these few files, and only for the class of '67. I didn't find lists for other classes. So.
Why wasn't this program continued?
Well, when did it end? Who's the oldest one of us, or the youngest one of us who was in the program? Jim, the guy from Illinois, came here in '78 as part of the program. Has anybody come here after '78? Okay, well, I've met one colleague up at Northern Michigan University who came here, I think, in '79. So I don't know what happened to the program. You know, programs die with whimpers.
I have a question that is what's happening now, and are you recruiting throughout the country, for instance, in the South?
I don't know. No. No.
No.
Yeah, I have a question. Have you seen similar small school talent search programs at other schools? Have you gotten a chance to see those in any of your research?
Use the mic. Can't hear.
Okay.
You got to remember, a lot of us are septuagenarians here, and stuff is starting to fail.
Okay, I asked if you, in all of your research, have gotten the chance to witness any aspects of other schools' attempts at small school talent search programs, and if so, are there aspects of those programs that you liked?
Mercy, do you know?
No, so I'm not sure if you realize this. Faculty are so walled off, separate from kind of the recruitment efforts of the institution.
Yeah, I'm not a sociologist at education. You know that, Lauren. I'm an environmental sociologist. And so I've been way out of my area here and just, mining the data. And so I do not know, I don't even know what Pell Grants measure. I'm not an expert in this at all. I'm just digging around into the programs.
This is a comment for Professor Keels. Thanks very much for a great summary of the challenges facing students from historically underrepresented groups going to college. And also your comments about the shift in thinking about putting the needs of the institution first versus the needs of the students, and focus on graduation or persistence rather than enrollment. And of course, that issue, I think you're aware, is very broadly subscribed to across the country. That is that colleges, particularly in the public college arena, are being forced to pay more attention to whether students graduate or not. And you see this in efforts like performance funding and basing an institution's state funding on the degree to which they graduate students. But I was going to mention that if you think back to that era, the 1950s and 60s, or I'm able to do that, I don't know if you are, it wasn't so much about discriminating, I guess you could say, against students who were from underrepresented groups. The mindset that college was something that you had to confront and succeed at yourself was very much in the air. So there's the stories about orientation day, where students were told, look to the left, look to the right. 50% of the people that you're looking at are not going to be here at the time of graduation. So something happened, and I don't know what it is, and maybe you have some thoughts about this, to change all that and to put the orientation much more now towards seeing students through to completion.
Yes. So a lot of it is just research and learning. So we've learned that, so that model was based on the idea that it was all individuals' talents that determined the outcome, and didn't recognize things such as, even if you have that idea that it's all the individual's talents, but recognizing that simply by the fact of possibly us coming from different socioeconomic backgrounds means that what you see as, if I am from a higher income family, what you see as my talent is actually all of the things that my parents have done to get me there. And once I get there, all of the things they continue to do that appear to be in the background, that's not noticed, that's assumed to be this individual talent difference, but it's actually a difference in preparation and resources. And that maybe if we level the field institutionally and provide the resources to someone else who may not have that family background, so once we make those differences visible, then we can see that it would be important for another student to have knowledge about what's the course taking pattern that would be the best to get through, and many other such things that are these structural differences. So it's kind of recognizing that, and then realizing that by the institution providing some of those structural supports, that more students can get through, and also recognizing that, well, you enroll a cohort of students because you believe that they have the academic talent to make it through to graduation. So if you start with that as your premise, that this cohort of students all have the academic talent to do college level work, then you're figuring out, well, why are some of those students that are not succeeding, what are the structural factors and other things that might matter? And also, there's some financial aspects of it. It's that it is more costly to recruit students than to retain students. So if you are going to recruit them and bring them to campus, you might as well invest in helping them persist all the way through. Well, one, they give you a donor pool that you can then tap into later. So it's kind of recognizing a lot of those things.
Okay. The comment I'm going to make is not academic, it's personal. Tom, you mentioned the good work that guidance counselors did. I have to tell you that in our school, Worthington, Minnesota, and I'm Mary Ellen Roosh, I was Mary Ellen Kipley, went by Kip. Anyway, we had a young man went the year before, and they came back for more. And I was told I was it. And then my guidance counselor hauled me into his office, and he said, I want you to give up the scholarship and let Doug Peterson go instead. And I was scared to death. The skin on my knees was shivering like a horse chasing off a fly. And I just looked at him and I said, no. And I went home and told my parents, and they were very upset. And as you heard, we weren't a rich family. We were tenant farmers. We moved onto that farm in 7th grade, and the landlord said he'd put the bathroom in, and he did. But it was 7 years later when we moved off because his nephew's wife wouldn't go there unless they had one. But so here's a guidance counselor. He said, you're only going to get married and have kids anyway. You know, it's like this would be resources wasted on me. I did have kids, and I have grandkids, but I did a few other things besides. I taught high school for 4 years, and I've been a productive member of society. And all guidance counselors were not helpful, and now I think I have closure.
I think we have time for... Yeah, we just have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions if the presenters...
I did not know until last night when she told me this story.
But I avoided him for 4 years in college because I didn't know, what kind of whatever.
Yeah, and you did well to do it. And so the question is, something happened that we both ended up here. There were not 1 but 2. We both came. So something happened that you didn't have to give up what you had.
No, I think because I had the merit scholarship that Chicago didn't have to pull me up as much. So
I don't think that the program was limited to just 1 student. I wasn't at all close to it after suggesting the idea, but I did serve on the admissions committee. And for that
you advise the university scholars at admission?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thanks for all the sharing.
Well, and that was great fun for me. This is another program that was for the highest ranking of your classmates, the people with two 800 or a 790 and an 800 SAT and a straight A average, and that did involve money, real money. That is money separate from the standard scholarship funds, because all of those 15 students got full tuition as a minimum. But there was no special appropriation.
Yeah, I came 5 years ahead of the class of '67, and but a very similar story, and I guess before this program. And my horizon in high school went no farther than the local state university in the South. And I got a letter from the University of Chicago saying, you scored very high on the SATs. We'd like you to consider the University of Chicago, which I'd never heard of. So I went to the library and looked it up, and it looked like a good school. And eventually I came. So, and I have to say, with due respect for the second speaker, despite the fact that it was a cultural shock to come to the big city from a place where the local ethnic restaurant was Joe's Spaghetti House, where I'd never seen a foreign movie, and where the kinds of people I knew were a very limited set. It was a shock, and it took some adjustment, but I think I benefited from the interaction, and yes, even the stress, the debate. I don't think I would have benefited from being in a safe space where I only talked to people that had similar backgrounds to myself and thought and spoke like I did. So anyway, I benefited from the University of Chicago despite the difficulties. I would have never come unless they had bothered to send me a letter saying, here we exist, why don't you come?
Thank you.
Okay, so I think unless I think there's one more question, but otherwise we can always continue the conversation in the Core Cafe just across the lobby. Thank you all so much, and let's thank our presenters one more time.